All right, so this is chapter 5's practice questions, the quiz that you already have the answers, but here's just a little bit more explanation about what's going on, what we're looking for. So when economists talk about growth in the economy, how do they measure that growth? Well, if we're really talking about growth in an economy, I'll always explain things before I actually look at the answers. We're talking about like how the performance of the country is doing, how production of different goods is doing. So when we want to think about that growth of the economy, we want to figure out what's going on with production. So select one with the absolute advantage and absolute change and nominal GDP. Well, absolute change would not really talk about that so much in terms of growth. We often refer to growth as a percentage. It's just to say that it's grown by 5% or 5 million is not enough as a measure of growth. We typically talk about, and when we look at nominal GDP, the problem with that is that it includes increases in prices due to inflation. So we want to strip out that component. So actually the answer will be with a percentage change in real GDP. Because absolute change is not a measure of growth, because growth is referred to as a percentage change. When a firm produces consumer goods and adds some to inventory rather than selling them, how is the increase in inventory counted in GDP? So this has been discussed in GDP calculation, but it's a point I want to make sure it's clear. So GDP calculates the value of all goods and services produced in a country in a given year. So if you're producing a good, but you're not necessarily selling it, it still needs to be counted in that year. And actually, if you go back to the section on investment counts increases in inventory, counts also investment in capital goods such as machinery and other things like that, and new residential structure. But inventory investment is clearly one. So it's not counted as consumption. It's not a statistical discrepancy. It's not respect to capital consumption allowance. It's really counted as investment. During the federal election campaign, the incumbent argues that he should be reelected because GDP grew by 12% during his 4-year term in office. You knew that population grew by 4% over the period, and that the GDP deflator inflation was 6% during the past 4 years. What can you conclude about real GDP per person? So at this point here, I'm not asking you guys to calculate this, but I'd want you to figure it out in a certain way. So if you think right now we have 100 million, let's say, in GDP, and to make it simple, we have 1 million in terms of population. Well, that means that the GDP per person would be 100. So if over this course of this time, GDP grew by 12%, well, we know that this GDP has grown to 112. So there's this growth of 12%. But if we also know, just even if we didn't even look at inflation, that population grew by 4%, well, now we would have 1.04 in terms of population, and 112 over 1.04 would be less than this 12% increase. It has to be less because 12% increase, it would be the same as having 112 over 1 million, which would be 112. That would be a 12% increase. But that disregards the fact that there's been a population growth. So that makes that increase smaller than 12%. And if at the same time we take into account that out of that 12% in growth, there might have been half of it that was attributed to increases in prices, we would see that while real GDP per person would actually be even smaller. Even without population growth, the fact that there's inflation, that 112 is not quite accurate because this 12% increase is a mixture of an increase in output, but it's also an increase in prices. And when we count real GDP, we have to disregard that portion. So it would have to be less than 12% for both of those reasons. But it's not going to become negative because one has like this kind of 6% effect, the other one has a 4% effect, and the total change was 12%. So it would grow, but by less than 12%. To actually calculate the exact growth rate and with this whole procedure, I don't need you guys to know. I just want you guys to keep in mind that in the economy, when we talk about like just nominal GDP growth rates, which is something we don't really look at, as was mentioned in question 1, we look more at real GDP growth rates, but we also want to look at population changes because that has a big impact on the welfare and the well-being of the people in the population. All right, next step. Use the following table to answer the following questions. Refer to table 5.4 using the GDP deflator to measure the average level of prices and using 2013 as the base year. What is the economy's inflation rate? So if we look at this, we had price of burgers from 2013 to 2014. Well, actually, the price of burgers has gone up by a quarter, so 25%. And if we look at the magazines, it's also gone up by a quarter, which is 25%. And a very simple example like this, where they're both going up by the same percentage, it's pretty much going to be that 25%. Because if inflation of one good is 25, inflation of the other is 25, it has to be 25. The checkpoint I have you guys do is to make sure that if you had multiple goods on an exam, you might have like 3 goods, and one goes up by 10%, the other one goes up by 20, and the other one goes up by 50. You know that the combined inflation rate has to be somewhere between the lowest and the highest. And whichever one it's going to gravitate towards depends on your weighting. So here you would have to take into account the actual quantities produced. So in 2014, I've produced 120 times is $5 and 200 times is $2.50. And then, so that would be my nominal GDP. So it would be, if I were to calculate it out, it would be $5 times 120, which would be 600, plus 250 times 200, which is another 500. It would be 1100 would be my nominal GDP. And my real GDP over here would be using the same quantities, but the other year's prices. So here 120 times 4 is 480. 200 times 2 is 400. So this would be 880. And once again, if I do this, minus 1 times 100, if you were to calculate it out, nominal over real times minus 1 over 100, you would once again see that this is equal to 25. Sorry about that. 25%. So I'd ask you guys to calculate it all out because you won't have typically a simple example like this, but also you should know the shortcuts to make sure that you could cancel some of these answers out. You might always see an example that has 2 same answers on a test. If that is the case, if that answer is right, both are right. But sometimes when 2 answers are the same, it might not be the right one. To encourage formation of small businesses, the government could provide subsidies. How would these subsidies be treated? Well, subsidies are like a parent transferring money to their kid, or the government transferring money to a citizen without any service or any good in return. So that is what we typically consider as transfer payments, and transfer payments are not included in GDP. So this would be the case. Not included in transfer payments would be what we're looking for. So I've attempted this exam and all of these answers are right. So hopefully this clarifies some of the questions you may have with respect to this chapter practice quiz.